Chapter 13. Josh watched Sarah disappear into the crowd. For a moment he thought about following her to apologize, but he quickly rejected the idea. He wasn't the one at fault. She was the one that had been treating him like fragile cargo. He winced at a sudden stab of pain. There was a headache forming right behind his right eye. It had started when he'd been sitting in this strange tent full of wax, and it had only been getting stronger as the minutes passed. The tips of his fingers where he had touched the bowl were also tingling. He looked back in the direction Sarah had gone. She had only been concerned about him. If the roles had been reversed, he would have acted the same way towards her. Why had he snapped at her like that? She hadn't deserved it. "Good evening, Mr. Taylor," a voice said from behind him. He turned around to find himself looking at the woman with the half-short, half-long black hair. She was smiling up at him pleasantly. It took him a moment to recall her name. "Oh, hello, Miss Curioso," he replied. "You can drop that first part," she told him, her smile never slipping. "Just call me Curioso. Everyone else does. You look like you're not feeling well." "No, I'm okay. It's just a headache." "Ah, so it has nothing to do with the pretty redhead angrily storming away?" She raised an eyebrow. "Not to worry. No one else but me heard your little spat." Josh looked away. He hadn't even considered that anyone else had heard him being such an ass to Sarah. The woman reached up and gently turned him back towards her by the chin. "The way I see it, she got off light," Curioso told him, lowering her voice. "Anyone could see that she was treating you like a child instead of an equal. After everything you've done for her, too, almost getting killed by demons, sacrificing your summer to help with her insane grandfather's ramblings, and now she acts like she has to take care of you? The nerve." "How the hell do you know all that?" Josh asked, taking a step back as he stared at her suspiciously. "And how did you know my name? Did Sarah tell you that? I can't remember if—" He sucked in a sharp intake of air as the headache flared. It felt like it was trying to bore through his skull. He closed his eyes and gently rubbed at his temples with his fingers. Curioso reached out and placed 2 fingers on the closed lid of his right eye. A rushing sound filled his ears. It was like the noise made by ocean waves crashing onto the shore. The pain immediately started to subside. Within moments it was gone entirely. It was replaced by numbness. The sound of the waves remained as she removed her fingers from his face. "There," Curioso said. "Isn't that better?" "Yes," Josh replied dully. He was having a hard time collecting his thoughts. It was like he couldn't latch onto them for more than a few seconds before they were washed away. He felt exhausted. "Good," she said approvingly. "I'm not able to take the pain away forever. For that, you'll need something more permanent. After all, a person could go mad from a headache like that, and I'm sure that you don't want that." "No," Josh answered with a small shake of his head. "Good. Come with me." Curioso wrapped her arm around his and led him deeper into the carnival. Most of the crowd hadn't made it this far inside yet, and they passed fewer and fewer people as they continued onward. He thought at first they were heading towards the large Ferris wheel, but before they reached it, she turned left and went over to a building shaped like a large old house. "We call this the Sea Lodge," she whispered to him as she leaned in close. "The cure for what ails you is inside. Go on. Go inside and feel better." "You're not coming in?" Josh asked in a slurred voice. "No, not this time. This time, it's all for you. Come on, then." She led him up the 3 steps to the house's door. Reaching into her pocket, she took out a small silver key attached to a blue oval-shaped keychain. She unlocked the door before stepping back. He glanced over at her as he reached for the doorknob, and Curioso gave him an encouraging nod. He opened the door and went inside. His head immediately cleared. The rushing sound left his ears, and the fog in his mind lifted. He blinked a few times and cracked his neck. He felt like himself again for the first time since he had entered the ceromancy tent. All of the anger and weariness he had felt was gone. Sarah's face came unbidden into his thoughts, and with it came a fresh feeling of guilt. He needed to find her and apologize. The door had closed behind him, and he reached out to open it. It was locked. He quickly took out his cell phone, but put it away again when he found that there was no signal. There was another stabbing pain behind his eye. It was so strong that his knees buckled. He braced himself up against the door and covered his face with his hand. A second jolt made him gasp for breath, and the third one caused him to cry out in agony. The pain was gone just as soon as it had started. Tears were welling up in his eyes, and he was feeling sick. His stomach was churning, and sweat was pouring off of his face. He pulled his hand away and looked at it. What he had thought was sweat was actually a pale white liquid. It smelled like sea brine. It was coming out of his right eye socket. He could feel the liquid slowly running down his cheek. It was oily, and his skin crawled where it was touched by the fluid. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. He tried the door again with the same result. Taking a step back, he kicked it as hard as he could. The door didn't even rattle in its frame. He was trapped inside. Trapped indeed. This was all part of some trap. The sudden outburst of anger, the debilitating headache that had come out of nowhere, Curioso's appearance, and whatever she had done to him when she had touched him. He was sure that all of it had happened with the purpose of getting him into this carnival exhibit. He had no idea why, but it was clear that was the case. Someone wanted him here. In a way, it was a relief. He had feared that he was losing his mind. At least he knew now that wasn't happening. It still left him with the matter of escaping the building. He turned away from the door and looked around. He was standing in a small living room. 4 chairs were set up around a short wooden table in the center of the room, and an empty fireplace had been built on the wall closest to them. There was an old fan on the ceiling. Its metal blades were still, and he could see spots of rust on them. His eyes fell on the windows. There were 2 on the right wall. He didn't see the carnival when he looked out of them like he should have. Instead, they showed a beach with high waves crashing into it. It was day outside, the sky filled with gray clouds promising rain. As he watched, a bolt of lightning raced through the clouds. It was soon followed by a rumble of thunder. He crossed over to the nearest window and carefully examined it. At first he had guessed that it was some sort of effect, maybe done with a projector or monitor. One of the bottom panes of glass was broken, however, and he could feel the cool ocean breeze coming through it. What he was seeing was real. He tried to open the window, but it was jammed shut. His attempt to open the second one was met with the same result. He was considering breaking one of them when the most excruciating stab of pain so far flashed behind his eye. He sank to his knees as he felt another gush of the sickly fluid spray from the socket. He gritted his teeth and forced himself back to his feet. He had no idea where he was or what was happening to him, but he was absolutely certain that he needed to find a way out. There was an open doorway leading further into the house. He stumbled across the living room and went through it. Chapter 14. Fully intending to tell Josh exactly what she thought of his earlier comments, Sarah returned to where she had last seen him. She wasn't all that surprised to find that he was no longer there. She had been gone for at least 20 minutes, and there wouldn't have been a reason for him to wait for her to come back. She looked around the general area for any sign of him. When she came up empty, she took out her cell phone and tried calling him. His phone went right to voicemail. She frowned. He must have turned it off. She started to slowly walk further into the carnival. He probably hadn't left since she would have seen him as she was returning through the gate. She tried calling him again, but she got the same result as before. She felt her anger slowly fading as she walked. She wanted to stay mad at Josh until she confronted him. She was finding it hard to do so. There had been something in his voice as he had snapped at her that she had never heard before. The experience of the House of Ceromancy must have rattled him more than she had thought. With a sigh, she let the rest of her anger go. She didn't want to yell at him. Not really. She just wanted to find her friends so that they could make things right. She frowned as she continued towards the Ferris wheel that towered over the rest of the carnival. Maybe she did act overly protective of him sometimes. It was only because she cared about him. Besides, he did the same thing to her. She approached the Ferris wheel and looked up at it. It was an impressive sight, especially now that the lights were lit up. She watched it slowly spin around its center shaft for a few minutes while she tried to figure out where to go. "Penny for your thoughts?" a woman's voice asked from behind her. She turned to find herself face to face with Sylvia Curioso. The woman was smiling, her head tilted slightly to the right. The dress she was wearing looked immaculate despite the large crowd moving around the carnival. "Oh, hello, Miss Curioso," Sarah said. "Not you too," Curioso replied with a laugh. "Your friend called me the same thing. Please, it's just Curioso." "You talked to Josh? I'm looking for him, but I can't find him." "It's a good thing that we ran into each other then. I know exactly where he went. I'd be happy to take you to him." "Oh, you don't have to do that. If you just tell me where he went, I can." Curioso waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. Follow me." She turned on her heel and started walking towards one of the buildings. Not really having much of a choice, Sarah hurried to follow her. The building they were headed towards had been made to look like an old run-down house. It was a bit of an eyesore, and there was no one else near it. "Josh is here?" Sarah asked dubiously. "Yes, indeed," Curioso answered brightly. "He had quite the headache, and I suggested that he rest here. It's one of the quieter parts of the carnival, kind of a little getaway in the middle of the chaos." "It looks like it's supposed to be a haunted house attraction." "We do have one of those towards the back of the park, but not this place. We have an on-site nurse that is taking a look at your friend currently, trying to help with that headache. The nurse says it's likely stress-related, the poor dear. Maybe it's from the argument you two had earlier?" Sarah felt her face grow red. "You know about that?" "I happened to be in the area at the time. For what it's worth, I think that you were completely justified when you stormed off. The boy had no right to speak to you the way that he did." She felt herself getting angry again. Curioso was absolutely right. She had done nothing to deserve being treated as she had been. To add to the embarrassment, other people had obviously seen him acting that way towards her. "I'll tell you what," Curioso was saying. "When the nurse is done looking him over and he's had some time to rest, I'll make sure to tell him that you're looking for him. Do you have a phone with you?" "Yes," Sarah answered absently as she continued to think about the wrong that had been inflicted upon her. "Perfect. He can call you when he's done. Enjoy the carnival, Miss Dyer, and let me know if you need anything." Curioso disappeared back into the crowd. Sarah took one last look at the building before turning away. There was no point in her sticking around and waiting. Josh would call when he was done, and when he did, she would give him a piece of her mind. Then, and only then, would she consider forgiving him. Something out of the corner of her eye caught her attention. She turned her head to find Jenni waving at her. She waved back before walking over to her. "Did you find Josh?" Jenni asked between bites of the caramel apple she was holding. "No," Sarah answered. "Well, sort of. He's got a headache, and he's with the carnival nurse now. One of the carnival workers is going to let him know that I'm looking for him when he's done." Must be a pretty bad headache to get a nurse involved. Maybe that's why he was acting the way that he was. Maybe. Jenni finished the apple and tossed the stick into a nearby garbage can. I have really got to stop eating before I have to get rolled out of here, but it's been so long since I've had fair food. So anyway, Maggie is going to be busy for a while. A fight broke out between a couple of teenagers, and she's getting the parents here to pick them up. Since you've got some time and I've got some time, want to hit up a few of the attractions? Sarah hesitated. Sure, sounds fun. Can we kind of skip the tent exhibits, though? Absolutely. Let's hit the rides instead. Nothing helps burn off calories like pure adrenaline pumping through your veins. Despite her mood, Sarah smiled. I don't think that's true. Hey, which of us has the nursing degree again? Trust me, it's pure science. Come on, let's check out the roller coaster. I feel the need. The need for speed? Jenni looked at her, impressed. You know Top Gun quotes? I may need to talk with your father about adopting you. Chapter 15. The open doorway led into a kitchen. Josh slowly moved around the room, surprised at how normal everything looked. With everything else that was happening, he had expected to walk into something much different. He wasn't sure exactly what that something was, but it definitely wasn't this. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all stained wood. A table with 4 chairs was in the middle of the room. Along one wall was a long counter, with a set of shelves above it. A sink was sitting below a window that looked out over the ocean. Next to the sink was a refrigerator. It was an older model, white with a rounded door and a pull-out drawer at the bottom. On the wall next to him was a switch. Unlike a standard one, however, this one was a push-button switch. He tried pushing the top button, but nothing happened. The bottom one didn't work either. The power was off. There was a door on the far side of the kitchen. He walked over to it and turned the knob. He assumed that it was going to be locked like the other door and windows he had tried. To his surprise, the knob turned and the door opened. The smell of the sea immediately washed over him. The breeze was cool, almost chilly, as he stepped outside and onto the sand. Overhead, the clouds were growing darker. The ocean waves were pounding into the shore with enough force that he could almost feel the impact from where he was standing. He walked around the house and found that it was at the bottom of a dune. No other way seemed to lead away from the beach, so he began to climb the hill. It was slow going, but he managed to reach the top after a few minutes of effort. When he got there, however, he found that he was in more trouble than he had thought. There was a desert on the other side of the dune. It stretched from horizon to horizon, nothing but empty sand, with the occasional scraggly tuft of green growth. He had no way of knowing which way to go, or even if there was a right way. The wind started to pick up, whipping the sand around his legs. Not having any other options, Josh returned to the house and went back into the kitchen. It wouldn't be long before the storm began. When that happened, he didn't want to be outdoors. He rummaged around in the cabinets and found a dust-covered lantern and a book of long matches. He had never used this type of lantern before, and it took him a few minutes to verify that there was oil inside and to figure out how to work it. Eventually he was able to light the wick, and the flame cast an orange glow through the glass pane. Something wasn't quite right. He looked around the kitchen, but he couldn't figure out what was bothering him. There was the general sense of dread that he had been feeling since he had entered the house, but that wasn't it. There was something more tangible that his subconscious had noticed, but hadn't relayed to the rest of him yet. He picked up the lantern by the metal handle and examined the kitchen again. It wasn't until he had reached a particularly dark corner that he realized what was wrong. The glow from the lantern wasn't penetrating the darkness as much as it should have. He wiped the dust from the glass with the edge of his shirt, but it didn't help. The light was only extending a few feet outward. It should have been illuminating far more of the room. He moved the lantern close to one of the walls. He could barely see the light on the wood. It was like it was being muted or somehow diminished. There were two doors leading out of the kitchen, the one that he had originally entered through, and a second closed one. He crossed over to that one and slowly pushed on it. It swung open on silent hinges. Given the age of everything around him, he would have bet that it would creak on its hinges. He went through the doorway and into the bedroom beyond. It was constructed with the same type and color of wood that the kitchen was. A large bed sat below two tall windows with thick curtains, and on the opposite wall was a dresser. There were two more doors, and a quick check revealed that one opened into a closet, and the other led into a bathroom with a toilet and clawfoot tub. Panic was starting to set in. He stopped moving and took a few deep breaths. Whatever was happening, there was nothing to gain by having a panic attack. There was a lot going on that he didn't understand, but that didn't mean that he didn't know anything at all. For one thing, he knew the house was connected to the carnival somehow. That much was clear by the fact that he was here in the first place. If there was a way to get here from the carnival, it made sense that the reverse would be true. The door that he had come through wasn't opening. There could always be another way, though. It seemed best to focus his search for a way home inside the house, at least for the time being. Setting out across a desert or picking a random direction along the beach to walk in could be dangerous. He already knew the house itself was connected, and besides, traveling anywhere would be difficult once the storm started. He would revisit leaving when he ran out of other options. He left the bedroom and returned to the living room. Starting at the top and working his way down, he examined every inch of the door he had entered through. It just looked like a normal door, albeit one that refused to open. He was about to give up when something occurred to him. Setting the lantern down carefully on the floor, he got down on his hands and knees and examined the space between the door and the floor. While it was too close to the ground to see through it, there was definitely a small gap between it and the floor. He got back up and went into the kitchen. An idea was forming. It wasn't much of an idea, but it was better than anything else he had so far. He searched around in the drawers but couldn't find what he was looking for. He needed something to write on, but there wasn't any paper anywhere. There wasn't anything to write with, either. Thinking outside the box, he pulled out one of the kitchen drawers and peered inside. He felt himself smile slightly. The bottom of it was lined with paper. He managed to tear off a section of it. Next up was a writing instrument. This problem wasn't as easy to solve. It wasn't until he remembered the book of matches on the kitchen table that he was able to work it out. He sat down at the table and smoothed out the old piece of drawer liner. The usable areas weren't very large, so he was going to have to be careful with what he wrote. He mentally composed his message and took a match out of the matchbook. Bracing himself, he bit his finger until it bled, ignoring the pain. He dipped the blunt end of the match into the blood. It was crude, but it would have to do. Trapped in the house, he wrote, "Need help. Josh Taylor." There was less there than he would have wanted, but it was the most that he could write with the space he had. He gently blew on the note to help the blood dry. When it didn't mark his finger when he touched it, he went back to the living room and slipped the paper under the door. He tried not to think about how unlikely it was that anyone would see it or, even if they did, be able to help him. He turned his head towards the windows as the rain began to fall. It was coming down hard, and the beach turned a darker shade of brown as it was soaked. As he watched, something struck the sand, something too large to be rain. He wondered if it was hailing. When more of the objects followed, he saw that it was something else entirely. He walked over to the window to get a better look. One of the objects struck the glass, and he jumped in surprise. Getting his breath back under control, He peered out as it slowly slid down the window. It was a slug. It was pale white, so pale that it was nearly translucent. The creature squirmed and writhed as gravity pulled it down the window and onto the ground below. Josh cried out as pain flared behind his eye once again. It was the most intense one yet. Chapter 16. At the beginning of the line for the roller coaster was a large sign that was designed to look like a small town's welcome sign. It was painted black with red trim and lettering, the same colors that adorned the nearby Ferris wheel. Written in cursive script were the words, "Welcome to Ex Oblivione." Ex Oblivione, Jenni read out loud as they passed the sign. It's been a while since my college Latin course, but I'm pretty sure that translates to forgotten. I have a hard enough time with basic Spanish, Sarah replied, deftly dodging out of the way of two children that raced into line ahead of them. Oh, believe me, I get where you're coming from. I took Latin because my guidance counselor told me it would help with medical terminology, but I barely scraped by with a passing grade. I'm pretty impressed with myself that I remember enough to read that sign. Sarah smiled slightly. This wasn't exactly how she had envisioned her night going, but she had to admit that she was starting to have fun. Jenni's upbeat nature was infectious. Hey, remember that time I told you that I wouldn't ask questions about things that aren't my business? Jenni asked as the line came to a stop about halfway to the ride. You mean that time less than an hour ago? She replied with a raised eyebrow. The time where you said that to me and then immediately asked one anyways? Yep, that's the one. I'm thinking about breaking my rule and asking you one of those kinds of questions. You already broke that rule. I just got done reminding you of that. Jenni shrugged. Funny, I don't remember ever butting into anyone's personal business ever. Never. Not once. Sarah laughed. Oh, well, I must be mistaken. Apology accepted. So if I asked you one of those super personal questions now with the caveat that you don't have to answer it if you're not comfortable doing so, would you hold it against me? That probably depends on the question. Jenni pointed at her with one finger. That is a very good answer. What the hell, though? I'm going to take my shot. Are you ready for this very personal question that I'm about to ask you? Probably not, but go ahead and ask it anyway. All right, here goes. How long have you had feelings for Josh Taylor? Sarah immediately felt herself begin to blush. She didn't do that very often, and she absolutely detested it when she did. She quickly turned her head so that her hair fell to partially cover her face. We've been friends since I moved here, she said, knowing full well that wasn't what her companion had meant by the question. Ah, Jenni replied simply. Sarah was sure that she would be pressed for more of an answer, but Jenni seemed content to let it pass. She exhaled a breath that she hadn't realized she was holding. Her face started to grow cooler, and she pushed her hair out of her eyes with her hand. Her father had asked her a similar question months earlier, and she had dodged it in a similar manner. The truth of the matter was that her feelings for Josh were complicated. Even though they had only known each other for a short time, he had already become the best friend that she had ever had. That friendship was very important to her. That was why his sharp words earlier had stung so deeply. Those feelings were the ones that she was sure about. Things got more complex when she started to wonder if her feelings for Josh went beyond friendship. She was pretty sure that they did, but she was also sure that she didn't want to ever do anything that could lead to them no longer being friends. She also didn't know if he had any of those kinds of feelings for her. She shook her head to clear it. Complicated was an understatement. This is me changing the subject as quickly as possible, Jenni said. It looks like something is about to happen on the stage. Sarah turned to look back towards the Ferris wheel. A large stage had been set up in the area between the wheel and the Ex Oblivione. It was in the shadow of the two large rides, so much so that she hadn't even noticed it when they had gotten into line. There was a small group of people moving around it as they worked to set something up. Maggie told me that there are 2 stages, Jenni said. One is in that big tent back where you enter, and this must be the other one. Did she say what they were used for? She made it sound like the other one is used for short plays and presentations. She didn't say anything about this one. I guess we'll find out. They're starting to bring up the lights. A series of light towers had been built on the side of the stage, and the large lamps were slowly starting to brighten. The Ex Oblivione line started to move, however, and the path through the metal line barriers took them under one of the loops and out of sight of the stage. They came to a set of stairs before the line stopped once again. This roller coaster is pretty impressive, Jenni noted. Normally, fair and carnival coasters are dinky little things with maybe a couple of hills or, if you're very lucky, a tunnel. This reminds you of a more permanent amusement park ride. Have you ever been to Cedar Point? I haven't, no, Sarah replied with a shake of her head. I've been to Disneyland, though. With all due respect to the House of Mouse, Cedar Point's thrill rides are on a whole other level. The Disney parks are designed for families, which is all well and good. Cedar Point is made for adrenaline junkies. This coaster seems like it would fit in there. There was a rumbling above them. Sarah looked up just in time to see one of the cars flying past on the track overhead. The riders screamed in a mixture of fear and delight as they were carried away further into the ride. That's it right there, Jenni said with a broad grin. Inject that feeling right into my veins. You really get into this kind of thing, Sarah said with a laugh. I hope you don't mind me saying so, but you and Sheriff Grant are very different people? I don't mind you saying that, since it's absolutely true. It causes some issues sometimes, but ultimately, I think it's the biggest reason that we work so well together. Life would be boring if we liked the exact same things and thought the exact same way. There would never be any new experiences or a different lens to see the world through. So you're on board with the old saying of opposites attract? Jenni shook her head. No, I think it's different for everyone. I think the key to being happy in life is to find that one person that makes you happy, really happy deep down, and to just ignore all the static when you do. That's simple, huh? The woman laughed. It's never simple. Life tends to be as complicated as it can possibly get every chance that it has. It's basically a roller coaster. You just get into your seat, buckle up, and hold on tight. Chapter 17. The pain wasn't stopping. Josh rolled around on the floor in agony, his hands clamped around the sides of his head. The part of his mind that wasn't completely paralyzed by the pain noted that more of the brine-scented liquid was forcing its way out through his closed right eye, but he wasn't able to concentrate on it. It felt like every one of his nerve endings was on fire. He tried to struggle past it. At one point he opened his eyes and tried to get back up. No matter how hard he tried, however, he just couldn't stay focused enough to even raise himself off the ground. He collapsed back down onto the wooden floor and struck his chin hard enough to make his teeth clack together. To his surprise, the pain behind his eyes suddenly began to fade. It was like the impact had shifted things around in his head. He knew that couldn't be the case, but instead of questioning things, he used the opportunity to get back to his feet. His legs were wobbly, and he had to use the nearby wall to keep himself upright. He wiped away the moisture from his face and looked outside. The rain of slugs had stopped. He furrowed his brow. Not only had they stopped falling from the sky, he couldn't see any of them on the beach anymore. It was like it had never happened. His eyes fell on a series of lines in the side. Maybe there was some evidence of them having existed after all. He half walked, half stumbled his way into the kitchen and through the door leading outside. The wind was colder now than it had been, but at this point he was grateful for it. The chill was helping to clear the rest of the haze from his head. He knelt down next to one of the lines and traced it with his eyes. It led directly down to the water and disappeared where the waves had washed it away. There were countless other lines leading towards the ocean from every direction. It appeared that all of the slugs had crawled into the water and disappeared beneath the surface. He wasn't sure how long he had been trapped at the beach house. Instead of just showing that it didn't have any signal, his cell phone was now displaying a blank screen. It was still on, but the screen was completely gray. He had never seen a phone act like that before. Josh closed his eyes and laughed. It was a humorless and somewhat bitter laugh, but he couldn't help it. With everything going on, he was focused on why a cell phone screen wasn't working. "Holy shit, man," he said as the laughter subsided. "You're starting to lose your fucking mind." The sky was still full of clouds, but they didn't look like they were threatening rain the way they had earlier. There was less light now, though, and it seemed as if night was coming. He had the feeling that he really didn't want to be there when it was dark. Not sure what else to do, he went back inside and closed the door behind him. He was most likely going to be stuck there when the night fell, whether he wanted to be or not. There was no way of knowing what would come to visit the house once the light faded away completely. He had to prepare himself as best as he could. It wouldn't be possible to defend the entire house. There were too many windows, and he didn't have any way to barricade them. He could have used wood from the floorboards or from breaking the furniture, but he didn't have a hammer or nails to secure them. His best option was to pick one room and lock it down as tightly as he could. The obvious answer was the bedroom. He collected the lantern and went into the room. As he looked around for a second time, he began to make a mental checklist for himself. He could close the curtains and stand the bed up on its side to block the windows. The dresser could get moved up against the door, and the bed sheets could be shoved underneath it to keep things like the slugs from crawling inside. He went into the bathroom and examined the bathtub. Turning the knob, he watched as water poured out of the faucet. He hesitantly held out his hand and let it run over his fingers. After a few seconds, he pulled them back and sniffed them. It didn't seem like there was anything wrong with it. He cupped his hand under the flow and took a small sip from it. There was no trace of salt or chemicals that he could detect. He turned off the water and nodded once. He didn't know for sure that it was safe for consumption, but at least there wasn't anything obviously off. Besides, there wasn't much he could do if something was wrong. He would just have to risk it. He put in the plug and filled the tub. The light coming through the windows was growing dimmer. Hurrying back out into the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator and looked inside. With the exception of a wasp nest that had been constructed in the upper right corner, there was nothing inside. He closed the door and went through all of the cabinets. His search came up empty. There was water, but there wasn't any food. He would have to worry about that later. Abandoning his search, he returned to the bedroom and began his preparations. His search through the cupboards hadn't turned up any food, but he had found a few cans of lamp oil. He set those on the small nightstand next to the bed, along with the lantern. Even with the newly discovered stock, there wasn't much fuel. He needed to ration it as best as he could. Turning the bed onto its side was more difficult than he had thought. Even after he removed the dusty mattress, the frame was extremely heavy. Eventually he was able to do it, but he was sure that it wouldn't be long until he was sore. He slid it up against the windows before taking a step back to examine his work. There was a small bit of the window exposed over the top. It wasn't large enough for much of anything to fit through, though, and he reasoned that it would also allow him to look outside if necessary. With that finished, he turned his attention to the door. Luckily, it pushed in towards the room rather than pulling out into the kitchen. He made sure that it was completely closed and turned the small lock beneath the doorknob. The dresser proved to be almost as difficult to move as the bed had been, but he managed to push it in front of the door. As the last step in the process, he moved the mattress into the center of the small room and dusted it off with his hand. He took off his sand-covered shoes and set them down on the floor before laying down on it. It wasn't very comfortable. He moved around for a couple of minutes before he decided that there was no good way to position himself. Still, it was better than the floor. He would just have to live with it. He tucked a pillow under his head and stared up at the ceiling. The last of the light faded from the windows, and all that was left was the soft glow from the lantern. It barely provided any illumination. The odd muting effect from the kitchen was just as prevalent here. He wondered what could possibly be causing it. The wind outside was picking up. It whistled past the bedroom window and rattled the walls. He put his hands behind his head and listened to it blowing, wondering if this was where he was going to die. Chapter 18. After they finally made it to the front of the line, Jenni quickly led them to the short queue for people waiting to ride in the front car. She had been insistent that the only way to ride a roller coaster was right in the very front, and she seemed determined to prove that statement. There was only one other set of riders ahead of them, so Sarah decided not to voice her opinion that any car was fine and just let the woman have her way. "I have a feeling that this is going to be amazing," Jenni said excitedly. "What are you basing that on?" Sarah asked as the riders in front of them got into their seats. "Pure gut instinct, my dear. Pure gut instinct. Plus, those people look like they had a good time." Riders from the train that had just returned to the station were standing on the other side of the platform and talking excitedly. They went down a second set of stairs and out of sight. They definitely looked like they had enjoyed the ride. "Finally!" Jenni exclaimed as a new train pulled up in front of them. "Time to rock." They got into the front car and sat down in their seats. Sarah fastened the seatbelt around her waist, and once Jenni had finished with hers, they pulled down the long black bar in front of them. It locked into place with a loud click, securing them in the seats. Less than a minute later, there was a small lurch as the train began to move forward. It cleared the small station and they headed outside on the track. Sarah looked down over the side and saw the line they had gone through to reach the stairs. Most of the people were looking back towards the main carnival area instead of facing the direction the line was headed. She raised her head to see what the crowd's attention was being drawn towards. The lights on the stage were all the way up now, and a man was standing on it speaking to the people gathered around the base. He was talking to a microphone, but she couldn't make out what he was saying due to the combination of the wind and speaker distortion. She continued to watch as the train began to ascend the first hill. She wasn't sure, but she thought that the person speaking was Leonard Liber, one of the carnival owners and the man that had dramatically opened the front gate earlier that evening. He was certainly moving with the same dramatic flair. The man raised the cane that he was holding and pointed it toward the right set of steps leading up onto the stage. This area was cloaked in shadows. The stage lights were turned away from it, and the stage itself was blocking the glow from the Ferris wheel. She could just make out something moving. The people standing closest to the spot the man had indicated all quickly stepped back. "Holy shit," Sarah exclaimed as the person emerged from the shadows. He was the largest person that she had ever seen. It was hard to tell from the angle and distance, but he looked to be at least 7 feet tall. It wasn't just the height, though. He was massive, with broad shoulders and an extremely muscular body. His head was shaved bald, and a neatly trimmed beard adorned his face. He was dressed as a clown, and a rather creepy one at that. "There's no way that guy is real," Jenni said quietly. "That has to be some trick done with stilts or something, doesn't it?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but she never got a word out as the train suddenly dropped down the hill. She had been so intrigued by what was going on at the stage that she hadn't realized they had reached the top. She quickly turned her attention back to the ride. The hill was steeper than it had looked from the ground. It went nearly straight down, and she felt an odd sinking sensation in her stomach as they rapidly descended. They reached the bottom, and the track took a hard right that tilted Jenni's side of the car towards the ground. After a few seconds, the track flattened back out, and they passed into a long tunnel. The tunnel was filled with cold mist that clung to Sarah's skin as they sped through. A series of red lights pulsed along the ceiling. Whispers surrounded them, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make out what they were saying. Everything put together created a rather creepy effect. The train burst out of the tunnel and immediately started climbing up another hill. There was a scaffolding on Jenni's side, and figures were moving across it. They were human-shaped, but they snarled and growled as they climbed along the wooden beams. She thought that she could see thick fur across their bodies, but it was too dark to be sure. She watched in amazement. They had actual people dressed in costumes on the roller coaster itself to create a scarier atmosphere. She had never heard of anything like that before. On dark rides and on a smaller scale, sure, but never an actual roller coaster. Maestru and Liber's was going all out. The train dropped down the hill, but this time it wasn't a simple straight fall. Instead, the track spiraled downward to within a foot of the ground and continued on in a straight line. There were more figures moving amongst the pillars and beams here, and they pointed towards the riders with threatening motions. "I told you this was going to be awesome," Jenni yelled over the wind. "You weren't wrong," Sarah yelled back with a wide grin. The track raised up with no warning, and they were suddenly inside of a large loop. Sarah felt the blood run out of her face as she was confronted by a giant eye in the center of the loop. It was suspended in the darkness, and it looked around wildly as the train looped around it. For a moment it seemed to focus right on her. The train slowed as it went around one final curve. It pulled back into the station and came to a halt right where it had started. The long bar raised up, and they undid their seatbelts before staggering onto the exit platform. "That," Jenni said as they went down the stairs, "was a mind fuck. How do you think they did that last part, the part with the eye?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, feeling her heart rate starting to slow back down to normal. "A projection screen, maybe?" "It must be. I didn't see any projectors, though." "I was too busy looking at the thing to even think about checking for any." Jenni shook her head as if to clear it. "Well, however they did it, it was one of the most insane rides I've ever been on. It was amazing, but also a little disorienting." They left the shadow of the roller coaster and moved back into the main crowd. Many of the people around them were talking excitedly about the huge man that had been presented on the stage. Most of it was drowned out in the general noise of so many gathered people, but Sarah was able to pick out words like enormous and frightening as they walked. Their path took them past the stage, but it was now empty with the lights turned off. There was, however, a sign leaned up against it. Sarah managed to weave her way towards it. "What's it say?" Jenni asked as she came up behind her. "There's not much," Sarah replied, furrowing her brow. "It just says, 'Bango the Clown.'"